I'm Bill Lucas, and I'm about to take you on a tour of 21st century skills. That will take us through some robust frameworks, the knotty issue of how you embed them in a school or college setting driven by subjects, the idea of learning transfer, which is central to this, and then just to close on some issues which I hope will lead us into a conversation. Let's start with 21st century skills. Where do they come from? Why are we using this phrase? Well, if you go to the classic dictionary definition, the second definition is that it is a characteristic of the imagined conditions of the period we're talking about. The first one is of course much more literal. It's just that it is the 21st century. Number 19, number 20, 21, and we've got there. It was of course a new millennium. That carried a little bit of extra excitement to it too. First use I can find of this in the sense that we're talking about was in the Royal Society of Arts, the RSA's journal, and it was talking about 20 years before the end of the century, a period of our life which might be rather different for us, and imagining the different kind of living and working patterns that we might find. In truth though, as we in the 1990s moved towards the new millennium, something rather strange happened. Those of you with at least a memory that will stretch back 20 and a bit years will remember something called the millennium bug, of which we were all fearful. And also in the 1990s, a number of the tech companies beginning to argue that school was going to change completely. It was going to shift entirely from bricks and mortar into this new thing called the internet. Bear in mind, 1998, Google is created, 2004, Facebook, 2006, Twitter, 2010, Instagram. And if you just cast your mind back, it's an astonishing journey we've come in 20 years. And 21st century and 21st century skills is a sort of shorthand for things will be rather different in schools. And as such, I think it was probably in a short term, a useful one. But if you stop and look at the particular challenges facing us today, I think you'll begin to see, as I hope you'll see as I argue the case, that we can be a bit more precise about what these skills, or we'll discuss what word we use about them, might be. So we've got really trenchant issues that we're facing at the moment, and we could, of course, add to that the potential incidence of global pandemics. We're drowning in data, so that the idea of selecting a curriculum is actually a serious job now. Do we simply expand and crush everything in? I think not, but actually that's the way so many curricula are going. We've got knowledge sources from all around us, in the palm of our hand, in the interactions that we have with people online and in the wider world. We are increasingly connected. And that's been so obvious, hasn't it, in the last decade. There is the challenge or opportunity or threat, depending on your perception of it, of artificial intelligence, something I'll touch on. Increasingly, patterns in the labor market are changing with increased self-employment. And we are, as Linda Grattan suggests, not just an aging society, but a society in which 100 years will become normal for our lifespan. So no longer the 70 years and 10 of the Bible, but of a much, much longer time. So if that is the case, what are the kinds of skills we might need, or wider skills or dispositions, as I'm going to argue, that might help us here? Well, I'm not going to read them all through to you, but I'm sure you can see them. And I think you can see there's quite a lot of overlap here. A lot of things to do with interdisciplinarity, problem solving and project management, critical and creative thinking, design, and because we need to deal with each other, high levels of intercultural and social and emotional intelligence required. Nothing very new there, you might say, and that's part of an issue that I'll come back to. So what kind of a thing are we talking about? What is it, whatever we end up calling it? Well, the OECD in its 2030 framework for education, I think helpfully distinguishes in this sort of interesting DNA thread of knowledge, skill, and attitudes and values, these three different interwoven elements. The knowledge element of this isn't just disciplinary, as in maths or science, but interdisciplinary, the things that sit between the subjects, and also very importantly, practical. The skill element isn't just the social and emotional skills that are all too valuable, or the cognitive and metacognitive skills that are, or at least the cognitive are traditional, the metacognitive are widely, increasingly sought after, but also physical and practical skills. And then you'll see that third green strand, attitudes and values, left blank because, well, that's the point, isn't it? That's what we as educators in our community, in our school or college or university setting, that's what we need to determine. So it's in that blend that what the OECD calls competencies are created, and what I'm going to call dispositions. So what are dispositions? Well, they are a combination of knowledge, skill, and the attitudes and values we bring to whatever situation we find in a particular context. And that context could be our own kitchen, it could be on screen as we are now, it could be in a class that's looking at the history of slavery, it could be in our life in the community, it could be in the workplace. But where it is will influence what it is. The ways that we describe these things called 21st century skills, are many and varied. This is an alphabet soup, isn't it, of descriptors. You'll see that in a not very subtle way, I've color-coded my own preferences. I could and will, at least metaphorically, make 21st century skill red in the traffic light sense, because I think it's unhelpful. It puts off some of the very colleagues I believe we need to have on this journey with us. So you take your pick. I'm indicating that capability and habit of mind and disposition and key competence and wider skill are quite close to what we're talking about here. Elsewhere in work I've done with colleagues in Australia, I've drawn on a well-known philosophical frame of Gilbert Ryle to move from knowledge through skill to capabilities and attributes, and finally to habits and dispositions. Knowledge, if you like, knowing what, the skill bit, knowing how, the capability bit, that's what these things are called by and large in the Southern Hemisphere. In New Zealand and Australia, it is knowing what, knowing how, and being able to do it. And where I want to take us, words like habits and dispositions, which imply not only that you have the capability, but you actively choose to do it, such that it becomes your default position. That's, I think, back to my lifelong learning slide, that's the holy grail of what we're talking about. Now, these 21st century skills type things, sorry, there should be an apostrophe in front of the oh, there is. The 21st century skills type things are widely finding a place in the national curricula of countries across the world. This is Esther Kerr and colleagues at the Brookings Institution in the States, and she shows how the skills associated with 21st century skills are appearing in some 70 plus different national curricula, and in a small number, just 11 so far, it may have grown since this research was done a couple of years ago, the skills that are being described are described right through from when you're very small, at kindergarten, right through to when you might leave formal education. Now, just in case you're thinking, well, that's all very new, isn't it? Of course, that isn't very new. And that's kind of my main beef with 21st century skills, that they're not 21st century skill. This is a book from the end of the 19th century, so more than 100 years ago, framed as character power. And there are some words there that seem to be remarkably modern. Adaptability is a word much used by the OECD. Grit, the word much in favor with researchers like Angela Duckworth, and so forth. There is a slight anomaly there if you allow your eye to go to the bottom of the screen. Princely manhood, not much in demand, I think, certainly not in Winchester, and perhaps not where you are. So it betrays its colonial past, doesn't it, in its decision to include such a thing. But as you can see, there are a set of kind of character, virtues, wider skills, the kind of things that are often referred to as 21st century skills. I've written, and you can get this if you like to read more about these things from the Expansive Education Network website. And this is essentially the argument that all of that's fine, but we should stop using this phrase. We should stop using it. I'll just give you a quick, just a reminder. So why we need to stop talking about 21st century skills is the pamphlet. We should stop doing that because it's vague, because it sounds evangelical, as if we haven't figured out really what they are, because it doesn't distinguish between skills that have always been important, like being able to be emotionally smart, like working with others, like sticking with things that we find difficult. They've always been important. They're not 21st century. That doesn't make any sense. They're eternal. And of course, the biggest thing that it strikes me as very odd is that the whole premise of 21st century skills is that it's a new era. We need new ways of thinking about it. But the idea that what is going to be relevant now in 2020 is going to be relevant in 2040 or 2080 or 2099 seems to me completely preposterous. It doesn't make any sense. If your argument is that time is changing and that we need new skills, then, well, to blankly assume that the skills we need for now are the same skills that we need for the whole century is silly. Across the world, there are some really thoughtful frameworks, and I'm going to take you on a little tour of them. Hopefully you'll see the point of this next section is to make it clear that there is a considerable overlap in the way that different approaches to this issue are operating. This is a very widely quoted one. This is the World Economic Forum, and their distinguishing taxonomy is to think of foundational literacies, which you might think of as the core elements of a school timetable, competencies, here they're using the word of the OECD, like critical thinking and creativity, communication, collaboration, and character qualities. Now, it's not immediately clear to me why curiosity is a character quality and creativity isn't, and it's not clear to me why curiosity isn't a competence where creativity is, and so forth. So immediately, the minute you start looking at anybody's framework, you realize that it's going to be something that you may or may not agree with, where the categories are going to overlap, but at least this one offers, as the next one does, a sensible overview of this amorphous territory, 21st century skills. The OECD answers the question, what are they, in a slightly different way, but you'll see the read across. They suggest that there are some technical skills here, some know what and know how. There's Gilbert Ryle speaking again. And some behavioral and social skills. I guess you might think those are quite close to the character description that the World Economic Forum has. And then they mainstream creativity and critical thinking. That's important because the OECD and its testing body, PISA, has really decided that critical and creative thinking, or as we're calling it, creative thinking, is probably the most important under-recognized attribute or disposition. And so important it is that I'm tasked with other colleagues in creating a new test for PISA in 2021. Just moving on now, there are many national organizations who have had a go at this too. Here's UNICEF. I like this particularly. It organizes these different clusters of skills around the desired outcomes, I guess, of where we're going. So if you want people who are good at learning, then they may need to be creative, critical thinkers who can solve problems. If you want people who are employable, etc. I'm not going to walk all the way around it, but I hope that makes sense. Just another way of doing it. Now, I'm not just, I hope, going to give you death by framework. I hope if you're a school or college leader and you're looking at this, you're saying, I could steal that, or I could use that as a way of framing this when I'm talking about it with parents, with employers, with students, with pupils, with my colleagues in whatever educational institution you are. Otherwise, they stay too vague. Here's close to hand Europe, the European competencies for lifelong learning. And Europe has taken each of these, or is in the process of taking each of these, and works them up into a more developed concept. So entrepreneurship becomes, now here you can see immediately, can't you, the challenge of anyone. I'm guilty as heck here, who enjoys creating frameworks. That's to say, the level at which you choose to operate can give you some challenges. So we've got entrepreneurship as the top level here, and then we've got things like vision and creativity, which seem to be enormous to me and bigger than entrepreneurship, sitting underneath it. So you takes your framework and you takes your choice. In the Southern Hemisphere, especially in the Asia Pacific area, they've adopted a term which is not one of my favorites, but it has some sense: transversal competencies. Transversal suggests that it exists across. And hold on to that metaphor, because we're going to need to consider that as we think about how we embed this in schools. I think, though, many of us, if we go to chat with our colleagues over a cup of something after a hard school or college day, may need to reach for the sick bag if we talk about transversal competencies. It's not very friendly, I think, but the concepts here are brilliant, and the sorting out of them and the organization and the clustering them really helpful. Singapore's interesting. Singapore's interesting because it's much admired by people across the world in terms of its success at the foundational literacies of PISA, but it's also driven by a vision of wanting more than that. So wanting the critical and inventive thinking and communication, collaboration, and so forth embedded in the school curriculum. Really powerful. A country where, until recently, till the lockdown, I probably have spent most of my time is Australia. I'm going to come back to this one too. I think it's particularly helpful, this cube model, that you can see how the subjects, they're the horizontal ones, the themes or the 21st century skill type things are horizontal, the subjects are vertical, and then you've got some priorities, some current curriculum priorities which go across everything along the top there. Sustainability, Asia and Australia's engagement with Asia, and Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander histories and cultures, a really important element in Australia. Australia goes one stage further, and with a national youth body, the Foundation for Young Australians, tries to connect the world of school and the world of college, or TAFE as they would describe it, with the kind of clusters of job employability characteristics that you might want to see. Quite nicely done here as artisans and designers and coordinators and informers, and lo, another framework is born. But there we go, that's the nature of the beast. Most recently, we've been doing some work with colleagues in Scotland, and they have a framework which they call meta skills, three clusters of these meta skills, and they're aiming to use this as a bridge between college and employment, so particularly relevant in apprenticeship. I know we've got colleagues from Bury College on the call tonight, might be of interest to you in your thinking. Now, sometimes this issue is approached, as my 19th century book cover showed, not from the perspective of curriculum or from the demand side of employability, but from an idea of character. Here's the VIA Institute on Character and its framework for things which look suspiciously like what turn up as 21st century skills. But in this case, these are seen as virtues, and they're drawing on the work of Seligman and Peterson and a tradition of positive psychology. Another parallel framework with which you may be familiar, the Jubilee Centre for Character and Virtues in Birmingham, offering a similar, slightly more classically oriented view of what might be desirable. Making the early running in these debates was a group in America, the Center for Curriculum Redesign and various others, and were referring to themselves as those interested in the Partnership for 21st Century Skills, have moved on from there and now describe this as a framework for 21st century learning. I can kind of live with 21st century learning, but I still think it falls foul of the logic hurdle that says we're going to need different frameworks as we go through the century. But there we go. Why do I say that? Well, just think about your own life 20 years ago. We wouldn't have been able to do what we're doing now. Skype was in its infancy. Well, I'm not even sure it was, but if it was only just beginning. The kind of things that we've been talking about, the social media that have been born in the last 20 years weren't around. Their framework is moving us in the direction I want to go, which is not just defining what these things are, but suggesting that they're going to need to be embedded in the curriculum, that they'll require professional development, and that culture will be critically important. A friend and colleague of mine in Canada has done terrific work in this area. This is Michael Fullen, and his initiative is New Pedagogies for Deeper Learning. And deeper learning is a concept I like a lot, and something that colleagues also in the United States, especially the National Research Council, have shown is a really helpful way of thinking about learning transfer. I'll come on to that when we get there. My friend and colleague Guy Claxton, and co-founder of the Centre for Real World Learning, and I have had a go at this too, imagining a fictional girl called Ruby, who is the fictional granddaughter of Rita, as in educating Rita, and she's in your school or college. And these are the clusters of these wider skills or dispositions that we're arguing she will need if she's going to thrive at home, at school, at college, at university, at work, etc. So I now want to talk about how you embed these things in schools and colleges. I'm mainly talking schools here, but I think it's equally relevant to colleges. And just to flip back in case you'd missed the title there, embedding is my key concept here. How do you really make these stick? Not a kind of afterthought, not the any other duties on your teacher's job role. Schools, as we know, are predominantly organized into small chunks of time, whether those chunks are 35, 45, 50, 55 minutes, 60 minutes, 1 hour, whatever. That's the way that many timetable, as I was once one in a secondary school, find it easier to organize the school day. Watch this space for next year, by the way, as secondary schools and colleges grapple with their inability to manage the social distancing and the space. And I think we're going to have to think a lot more creatively about chunks of time. But that's for another lecture, for another discussion. So they don't appear on the timetable. So clearly we've got to find a way of injecting them into the life of the school. And one of the metaphors that Guy and I use is of split screen teaching. And here on the right, just to remind you, you've got the cube that is the Australian curriculum, reminding us about that idea of intersection. So split screen, the metaphor suggests that on the one hand, you've got the knowledge of what it would be to be in a history lesson. And on the other side of the screen, you've got the disposition, might have been historically referred to as a 21st century skill of, say, critical thinking. So you couldn't navigate your way through the causes of the First World War, or indeed the current American presidential election, if you weren't able to engage your critical thinking capability, could you? So they need to be embedded, not just in history, I would suggest, but in many other subjects too. The second core element that we found to be helpful here in the embedding process is to make them less abstract. Critical thinking, like actually a subject like history, is quite an abstract concept. But once you say, well, let's teach children or young people a thinking routine that regularly requires them to say what makes you say that, suddenly you're into critical thinking. Or if you want a collaborative rubric, think, pair, share. Or if you want an imaginative rubric, then see, think, wonder, and so forth. This is the work of Project Zero and the visible thinking suggestions of colleagues like Ron Richart and others at that very splendid center at Harvard. Over the time that at the Center for Real World Learning, and here we're drawing on work we've been doing in practical learning, in engineering, in critical thinking, creative thinking, in the development of tenacity, and most recently of what we're calling zest. We've found that there really is a cyclical, iterative process here. I'm going to make step one what we're really talking about right now, which is getting our head round what it is that we're talking about so that we're not vague. In other words, developing a real understanding. I'm using the word capability here. I toggle between capability and disposition. Capability because it has such currency in the Southern Hemisphere, And that's where a lot of these case studies come from. Step 2 is cultural, establishing the climate. Step 3 is really focusing on teaching and learning. And step 4 is student agency and really engaging with young people so that it spills out beyond the classroom into the co-curriculum and extracurriculum. If you take one example of a recent piece of work, it's lovely to see Thomas Tallis on the call. Their model, which they've developed in harmony with us, is Stage Centre in the Durham Commission on creativity and education, and very clear, not just creativity, but what creative thinking is and what teaching for creativity looks like. We've got to have that level of clarity, just as you would do in a literacy class, if we're going to be able to embed it. There would seem to us, when we're dealing with these wider skills or dispositions, to be some principles emerging. These principles, interestingly, have recently been validated by a 4-year study that I've been part of at the OECD. I particularly like, in this crowded world, number 10, leave space for the unexpected. Well, we've got plenty of space for the unexpected at the moment, and always number 1. That if we're talking about some of these things that aren't as neatenable, uppable as a GCSE 1,000-page syllabus for the 3 GCSE sciences, then we need to frame our learning with questions which often don't have one right answer. Now, sometimes they will, sometimes it will be a question of fact, but many times they won't. The kinds of teaching and learning methods that work well are what we've taken from Lee Schulman, his term, termed signature pedagogies. That's to say, they are those teaching and learning methods that so quickly align and neatly align with the target outcome. So if you're wanting creative thinkers, then find pedagogies which engage their creativity. If you're wanting collaborative learners, then think about how you can construct the experience so that there will be maximum opportunities for collaboration, and so forth. Here's an example from one of my favorite schools, a bit like Thomas Tallis, very advanced in its thinking. Similar models, because there's a dialogue between the two schools. This is Rooty Hill High School. If I just zoom in on the legend that goes with their poster, which is everywhere in the school, that they've thought about a common language for 21st century skills. Key verbs they want everybody to be using. What the disposition is, what its sub-disposition is, the opportunities that young people will have, and the kind of visible thinking routines that they'll all be encouraged to use. Here we are in Chile, similarly working with that model. This time now, you can see from their staff handbook, it's a similar circle, but it's been translated into Spanish. And again, I'm not sure, John, whether you've seen this, taking the same kind of approach that Tallis and Rooty Hill High School have taken to the work here. I've only recently found a terrific set of curriculum resources from the state of Alberta in Canada. And I particularly like this as a model of embedding, because it takes one cluster of dispositions. Creativity and innovation is their phrase, doesn't really matter. It then describes indicators of what it would look like if it was really happening, and then gives practical examples in the first person as if the student was the owner of it. I like that. And I'll come on to assessment, and I'll come on to student ownership of this as we go through. The other thing that Alberta has done, which if you Google it, you'll find very quickly, is that they've mapped creativity and innovation and a number of other cross-cutting skill clusters into the subject disciplines. Back to our split screen idea. What does it look like to be creative in maths? What does it look like to be a critical thinker in geography, etc.? Skills Builder and the partnership around it have done terrific work too. Not only have they defined a set of employer-friendly descriptors of these clusters of dispositions, but they're also beginning to suggest guidance as to what you might do if you want to make it effective. Keep it simple, start young, measure it, focus tightly, keep practicing, bring it to life. The fourth part of what I want to talk about is a a core concept here in anything to do with anything that we imagine might exist in more than one setting. That, by the way, colleagues, is everything we do pretty much in education, isn't it? We may not call it that, but when we teach someone to be kind in RE, we rather hope that that might spill out into the playground, don't we? When we teach them to wrestle with complex problems and equations in maths, we rather hope that the same tenacity might find a place on the sports field. When we invite them to collaborate with people they don't normally work with in an inquiry in science, we rather hope that when it comes to community endeavour, they may feel the confidence to be able to go up and say, hello, I'm Bill, who are you? How can we solve whatever it is, work on whatever it is we're doing together in the community and so forth. So this idea of learning transfer, learning something in one place and then using it in another place is foundational to what it is to be a teacher who cares about lifelong learning. It is, I would argue, the holy grail of learning, that we teach something or learn something in one setting and it can then be applied in another. And most of us are rather vague about how this miracle happens. It's even to be heard when sometimes chatting to very good teachers here that it kind of just happens, or it's osmosis. I never have time to think about, and that's okay. Please don't take this as in any way critical of your practice, but actually we know a bit about this. And here are just 3 thinking frames of making this abstract idea of learning transfer a bit simpler. The first is that we can think about it as something that we may have learned in the past that we use now. I think of a really simple example from my own personal life. When I was very little, I remember hitting my thumb with a hammer in some early attempts at carpentry, and I remember my mum saying, hold your breath and count to 10. Anybody that resonate with anyone? All she was doing very sensibly was A, giving me something else to think about, and B, giving me a small amount of time just to allow the dull throbbing of the pain to reside sufficiently for me to regain my equilibrium. So what I'm teaching or learning there is just a way of deferring losing it, a way of immediately showing my emotions and anger and frustration and pain and whatever. Fast forward to a meeting with difficult colleagues, and nobody on this call, I hasten to add, and it's very easy, isn't it, to find oneself almost losing it, or possibly watching today's news, losing it as somebody says something that seems to you to be positively imbecilic. Well, then just remember what your old mum might have said to you, hold your breath and count to 10. That just sense that way forward now from something that had very small, very different very different contextual beginnings, we can use something that is practically useful. Or it might be that when we learnt it, it was very near to us, as in it was how to draw a map in geography. But then we realize that mapping is a concept that has massive application elsewhere. Or we learn something about scale in maths, and then out on a walk, we realize with a map in hand that actually this scale thing is rather useful because we're lost and we don't know how far it is to get from X to Y. We're transferring something from one place to another. Or it might be, and here's the situation that most of us are in now when we're introducing a new concept to students, that we're having to say, trust me, I've already reminded you of the stuff you're using that you've learned from the past, and the stuff that you're using that you've learned in Mrs. Thingy's lesson or out there on your placement. Now I need you to trust me because I'm going to introduce something to you which I hope you're going to find useful in some other walk of life. And in that case, it's very helpful to invite them to think about how they've used it or encountered it already. In adult learning, this is often referred to as really being clear about the student's prior learning. It works just as well in schools too. So 3 simple ways of thinking about learning for transfer, and 10 simple evidence-based practices that you might like to bear in mind. And I particularly thank my colleague Michelle Anderson in Australia, in Melbourne, who with me and the Victorian Curriculum Assessment Authority have been working on learning transfer, and Michelle's work on this has been very influential for me. So just some practical cues to you that you might find helpful. Most important of all, give opportunities to practice in many different contexts if you want expertise to be achieved. Nearly there. Thank you so much for listening. We're just about 3 or 4 minutes away, and I want to round up this argument. So just to sum up so far, 21st century skills was an invention of the 1990s. It served us well, perhaps, as signaling we need to do things differently, but I believe now it's lazy and evangelical and unhelpful, and doesn't require us to do the deep thinking and deep learning that we need to do if we specify what we want young people to leave, whichever whichever part of the educational system we're in. And we need to get more specific about that. We need to understand how we teach it and the cultures that will encourage it. And ultimately, as I'll go on to discuss in a minute, we need to consider how and if we might and when we might assess it. So the first key set of key issues is that the pedagogies that you might choose for these kind of things, what I've historically thus far referred to as signature pedagogies, are a little different from perhaps the more narrow palette of largely didactic, essentially didactic methods that we all have to have in our repertoire. This is a nice set of examples from the world. I've deliberately chosen this because it rather kind of challenges expectations. So this is an economic body talking about the importance of social and emotional learning and suggesting some of the skills, the kind of teaching and learning skills that might be relevant here. By the way, that list in the middle is pretty relevant, I think, for whatever you're doing. And whether you're in an apprenticeship pathway, learning how to be a caregiver, or whether you're dealing with young children, or frankly, whether you're dealing with your more intransigent colleagues, if you have any. Of course, I'm sure you don't. You live in a perfect world. These kind of things are very helpful. I like very much what New Zealand has done in framing this as a dialogue between what the teacher does and what the student brings. It seems to be, and I like that, there's a sort of similar DNA thread idea here. And they, like Australia, use the idea of capabilities. And capabilities are a combination of disciplinary meaning making. So what sense you make of something in maths or in the real world, and your critical inquiry and perspective taking, so that you end up being a contributing, active citizen in the world out there. This is an area of our special interest at the Centre, and some work that I and Ellen Spencer have done quite a lot of thinking, given quite a lot of thinking to, and it's a whole issue of assessment. How do you assess 21st century skills, dispositions, habits, whatever you want to call them? And the answer we would suggest is by using a number of different methods. The minute you try and reduce it in a reductionist sort of way, it probably won't work. If you go to schools like Thomas Tallis or Rooty Hill High School, you'll see that they tend to use some kind of more portfolio or e-portfolio type approach. And that, I think, is what increasingly schools will do. In fact, read my lips, in 10 years, if we're still in lockdown then and still talking to each other on the successor to Zoom, I think we'll be in a very, very different place with regard to assessment. Isn't it interesting that it took a pandemic to make us rethink the GCSE issue and the whole issue, our approach to assessment at 16 plus. If you've not given this much thought, go and look at the very interesting Learning from Lockdown website that Peter Hyman is running at the moment. You Google Learning from Lockdown and Big Education, you'll see some fascinating blogs, including one from yours truly on that site. The general opinion when it comes to effective assessment is that the deeper and more complex your area is, and many of these dispositions are complex, the more varied your assessment approaches need to be. Here's a very interesting continuum of approaches offered by Darling Hammond. Brookings, whom I quoted earlier on, go one stage further and say that just as you would if you were thinking about progression in literacy or numeracy, you'd need to spell it out in terms of progression. It's going to be helpful to do the same thing with respect to these wider dispositions or habits. Here is the Australian national curriculum with regard to critical and creating thinking, and a continuum that goes right through in 2-year batches from kindergarten through to top end high school or secondary. Here's the second part. So there are 4 components to what they're subdividing critical and creative thinking, their term for creativity, as. Nearly there. The fourth, and in many ways, and here's what we're doing right now, issue is professional learning. These are the learnings from a 4-year research project. You can download this for free if you Google that book title. 11 countries came together, focused initially on the 5-dimensional model of creativity that we've developed at the University of Winchester, and latterly with the energetic imagination of all the participating schools, thousands of schools, tens of thousands of young people, looking at ways of both teaching and assessing critical and creative thinking. Here's the takeaway with regard to professional learning. It can be done. Intentionality is important, so you don't leave it to chance. We need considerable support. It takes time, and there are many different ways of doing it, which is, I think, not a bad message to leave you here now. So whether you're way down the track or just putting down your hands at the front of the start line now, thinking, next year in my school or college, I really want to make progress with embedding these really important fundamental dispositions for success in life, what might you do? Well, I'm going to open this up as my first question in a moment. What might you do next, to all of you on the call? But I'm going to give you 3 suggestions, and then I'm going to unshare my screen and we'll come back together. So the first thing I think you might like to do is to, with your colleagues, do an appreciative inquiry map of what you're already doing that's helpful and good and interesting and worthwhile in this space. Be as inclusive as possible so that you get maximum engagement from colleagues. The second thing you might like to do is to do some cross-mapping and to take whichever of the dispositions you favor, whether they're Ruby's 7 C's or Michael Fullan's or anybody else's or the OECD's or the World Economic Forum, kind of doesn't matter which, but you'll have to decide which, and you'll have to define them, to take them and do some mapping against the formal curriculum world, the timetable that your students operate by. And then finally, make a cunning plan. So if you're thinking about next term, what small, modest steps might you take to make this more likely to happen in your school? You will find bear traps along the way. People will say, this is progressive nonsense, or we have to focus on X or Y because of attainment 8, or you can't do this. I suggest you calmly say, it isn't nonsense. There's a really good evidence base, and we're taking it really thoughtfully and seriously as we go about using it. In fact, we've decided not to use the term 21st century skills because we think it's too vague, and it might put off the very good teachers and employers we want to carry with us on this journey. Oh, by the way, if you need a bit of support, there are 1 or 2 books out there, only too keen to fly off the virtual Amazon bookshelves if any of you feel so minded. If you're thinking of your beach reading, for example, in your hypothetical staycation, then they're the perfect 5 books to tuck in your rucksack along with a decent picnic. If you feel moved to contact me, I'm very friendly and try to reply to my emails. There is our Expansive Education web address. There are the 2 Twitter addresses, Twitter handles that we use. Thank you so much for listening. I'm going to now invite you, if you choose to just enable your video. I'm going to stop sharing, and I'm going to that has worked. That's very wonderful. And I'm going to just put the chat screen on to see if there's anything you've been saying that I want to pick up on immediately. And I'm just scrolling down. Sorry, I can't do all of these. John Nichols, is there an example of an international framework that includes visual literacy as a core competency? No, but you might like to have a conversation with my colleague Janet Hansen, because we've been having really interesting discussions about this with regard to some engineering work that we're doing. Other things, various questions about assessment. I'll come on to that in a second. And now I'm going to invite you, those of you who wish to contribute at this stage, to remind you this has been recorded, so there's a chance to go back on that. So if you want to be seen, make yourself seen. If you want to ask something or comment on something, I've got so many of you on my screen that I keep having to scroll about 3 times to find you, but I'll do my best to catch you if you try and wave expansively at me. And sometimes you haven't got a name, so I'm going to have to use whatever you've described yourself as. So I'm just going to have a first pass across to see anybody waving at me, because you'd immediately like to come in and say something. Just looking to see who'd like to start off the dialogue, or whether you're going to be very, very shy. And nobody yet, I'm seeing, waving at me. Joyce looks like she may have gone to get a cup of tea. Dan, you've waved at me and I've caught your eye. What would you like to say, sir?
Mine was the question I typed in there. I'm in Scotland here, and we have something called Higgius 4, and part of that is how we're assessed and judged, and one section is the creativity and employability, so that is good. But until we are assessed by creativity and how well schools are doing on these progressions, will it ever be a main priority for school when they're looking for standards? And my previous page is about raising attainment. So within Scotland, is it a section, but does it need to be raised more as a profile within the assessment of schools?
Okay, great question, Dan. Let me have a go at it and then open it up to others who might like to contribute. PISA 2021 is going to assess creative thinking, and there's a useful historic track record for PISA taking things seriously and then gradually beginning to influence educational policymakers. So if you went back to the 2015 PISA test of collaborative problem solving, it spawned a number of really good instruments for recognizing what all of us with the brain have known, that much of what we do in life is a collaborative endeavor and not a heroic hot afternoon public examination experience. And the kind of formative assessment materials have been really powerful. It hasn't, as you will have noted, made its way into schools much, because we don't assess it. We honor it on the dance floor or in an exhibition or in a school play or on the sports field, but we don't really. The second thing I'd say is that you're in a great country. Of the 4 home nations, I think the Scottish Curriculum for Excellence and the work that Skills Development Scotland is doing on meta skills is highly likely to make what you've just asked more likely to happen than it is in the other 4 home nations. Wales is coming up fast. Their new national, I don't know if I've got colleagues from Wales here, but the new national curriculum is terrific. It's got a whole series of explicit foci on embedding the kind of things I've been talking about in the curriculum. The third area is that I think, I am an optimist, Dan, so forgive me if you think this is naive, but I think the fact that we get unanimity between the policy world, much of the educational world and employers is a really good boost for this. So I started with the World Economic Forum framework, and I think that it's got an employability set of legs. Whereas if you think back to the Ken Robinson report 20 years ago, it was pitched as a sort of, almost as something, employers were saying, we want people who are literate and numerate. Educators were saying, we want people who are creative and have self-esteem and all the rest of it. And I think, again, optimist speaking, these agendas are meeting. And so I'm quietly confident without over pushing it, if you found you had a few Scottish pounds to spare, the Teaching Creative Thinking book has quite a whole section on the issues that you've been talking about. Thanks, Dan, so much. Let me just look back across. So wave at me or use an icon if you want to catch my attention, or if you're just very happy listening. That's all very fine too. If not, there's a severe danger I'll pick on people I know, which is very mean of me, but will be done in the nicest possible way. I'm going to pick on Phil Avery because he's always happy to contribute, aren't you, Phil? Phil, what are you thinking about this, and where are you with the discussion point about whether we call them 21st century skills or not?
Definitely not 21st century skills, agree entirely. I just think why are we putting a time on it? Whereas an awful lot of this is context specific, maybe to a particular subject or to a particular area of the curriculum. I think the tricky bit, I think teachers like the idea of what we're talking about, teaching dispositions, teaching character as well as their subject. I think the difficulty is getting them to build the habits, to build it into their teaching in the moment. So they like the idea, they get how it fits with their subject. They can look at their curriculum and they can see that, and they get how it fits the vision of the trust. It's in the moment teaching, they fall back on old habits, old ways of doing things, the old PowerPoint presentation that maybe is in that folder. And where we're wrestling at the moment is how you replace old habits with new, and what those new habits look like. So for me, looking at more and more of those techniques of teaching and how we can embed those is absolutely critical, and the professional development that sits alongside that.
Thanks, Phil, and thanks for allowing me to volunteer you. I would say this, wouldn't I, but it's a foundational premise of the Expansive Education Network. And next on the next webinar, which I should have mentioned, which is on Wednesday, the 1st of July, I'm going to be exploring this very issue of habit change and action research, and how schools can make small tests of change in a rigorous way to make what seems like a first go at something become a second go, and then a third go, and then become a disposition. And that progression from know what, know how, be capable to it being a disposition is, I believe, it really is a powerful model, not just for students, but for our colleagues as practitioners here. I'm looking back now at all of you to see if there's anybody else in the final minutes before we say thank you very much and goodbye. So just wave at me if there's anything you want to add now. Bearing in mind, feel free to email or tweet. Robin, I can't tell you whether you're wanting to come in or whether you were just whether that was a quizzical look.
I was wondering, I'd like to have a proper look at some of the slides. Where is the recording going to be available?
That'll be on the Expansive Education Network site. And all being well, with the miracles of technology, and I think we're going to transfer it into a different medium. I don't want to put pressure on Carol, but tomorrow or the day after, with the following wind. Those nice people at Zoom will send us a massive file which we can then play with. Okay?
Thank you. Thanks,
Robin. Just looking around to see if anybody looks likely or is looking away. Can't read you, David, whether you're wanting to say something or just you're caught in the headlights.
Just caught in the headlights, thanks.
Caught in the headlights. Okay. So look, colleagues, thank you very, very much for giving up an hour of your very busy time. I wish you the very best. I hope we might have your company when we meet again in a couple of weeks' time, thereabouts. Do have a look at the resources I've mentioned. Please go and have a play on the Expansive Education Network site. Thank you to my colleagues Carol and Janet for being part of all of this, and all of you who are leading the way in making these aspirations become, as Phil said, habit. And it really is ultimately, isn't it? It is a teacher habit change project that we're all involved in. So thank you very much. Enjoy whatever the rest of the day holds for you. See you soon. Bye-bye.
Bye.